Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab. Now let's begin. Wallace Ritter had built his life with his hands. 40 years as a master carpenter, crafting everything from intricate furniture to entire home renovations. His wife Elena used a joke that he could see 3 moves ahead in any situation, like a chess player studying the board. She'd been gone 2 years now, taken by cancer that moved faster than either of them expected. At 71, Wallace found himself in his son Alan's guest room, surrounded by boxes he hadn't bothered to unpack. The room was sterile, painted a gray, so pale it seemed apologetic for existing. Alan had insisted he move in after Elena's death. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone in that big house," his son had said, conviction bright in his eyes. What Alan hadn't mentioned was that his wife Morgan had already been calculating how much they'd save by renting out Wallace's property. Morgan Grimes had seemed pleasant enough when Alan first brought her home 5 years ago. She'd smiled at the right moments, laughed at Wallace's stories, and complimented Elena's cooking with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. But Elena had seen through it. 3 months before the diagnosis, she'd squeezed Wallace's hand during a quiet evening and whispered, "That girl's got a smile like a shark. She's after something." Wallace had dismissed it then. Now, living under Alan's roof for 6 months, he understood exactly what Elena had meant. The first month had been tolerable. Morgan maintained her mask of polite civility, though Wallace noticed how her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at him. The second month, small cruelties began. His favorite coffee mug disappeared, replaced with a chip cup that looked like it came from a yard sale. His medication would be moved from where he'd placed it, forcing him to search the bathroom cabinets. Once she'd accidentally donated several boxes of his belongings to Goodwill before he could unpack them. "Oh my God, Wallace, I'm so sorry," she'd said, hand pressed to her chest in mock horror. "I thought those were just old junk. You should have unpacked faster." Alan, wrapped up in his 60-hour work weeks as a corporate attorney, barely noticed. When Wallace tried to mention Morgan's behavior, his son would wave it off. "Dad, she's stressed. I'm working late every night. Cut her some slack." It was easier for Alan to believe his wife was perfect than to see what stood right in front of him. Wallace recognized the willful blindness. He'd seen it in construction sites when men refused to acknowledge a crumbling foundation because fixing it meant tearing everything down and starting over. By the 4th month, Morgan had stopped pretending entirely when Alan wasn't around. She'd make Wallace wait hours for dinner, serving him last with portions that looked like scraps. She'd blast music late into the night, knowing his bedroom was directly above the living room. She'd invite friends over and make jokes about Alan's father, the freeloader, while Wallace sat in his room, listening to their laughter echo through the walls. Wallace endured it with the same patience he'd used to sand difficult wood. Some materials required a gentle, persistent touch. Fighting back too early would only splinter everything. The house itself was a monument to Morgan's taste. All sharp angles, chrome fixtures, and furniture that looked expensive but felt hostile. Nothing was meant to be lived in. It was all meant to be photographed for her Instagram account, where she portrayed herself as a successful interior designer, though as far as Wallace could tell, her only client was Alan's bank account. Wallace spent his days in the garage, the one space Morgan hadn't claimed. Alan had told him he could use it as a workshop, and Wallace had slowly reconstructed a small corner of his old life there. His tools hung on pegboards, organized with the precision of a surgical theater. He'd started taking on small projects, a custom bookshelf for a neighbor, a repaired table leg for the woman next door. Working with what kept his hands steady and his mind sharp. It was in the garage that he'd first noticed something odd about Morgan's routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, around 2 in the afternoon, she'd leave in her white Mercedes, dressed like she was heading to a business meeting. She'd return 4 hours later, slightly disheveled, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't the brand she wore in the mornings. Wallace had mentioned it once to Alan. "Where does Morgan go on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons?" Alan had barely looked up from his laptop. "Yoga class. Sometimes she meets with clients." But Wallace had lived 71 years, and he knew the difference between someone who'd been to yoga and someone who'd been doing something else entirely. He said nothing more. He simply filed the information away the way he'd always cataloged the grain patterns in different woods. The dog bowl incident happened on a Thursday evening in late September. Alan had called to say he'd be working late again. A big case, a demanding client, the usual excuses. Morgan had smiled when she took the call, a particular kind of smile that Wallace had learned to recognize as dangerous. She'd cooked dinner, which was unusual. The smell of roasted chicken and vegetables had filled the house, and for a moment, Wallace had wondered if perhaps he'd misjudged her. Maybe the stress Alan mentioned was real. Maybe she was trying to make amends. When she called him to dinner, Wallace had walked into the dining room to find two place settings at the table, and on the floor, next to the chair where he usually sat, was a stainless steel dog bowl filled with chicken scraps and vegetables. Morgan stood by the table, her phone in hand, already recording. "Old dogs eat from the floor," she said, her voice bright with malicious joy. "That's where you belong, isn't it, Wallace?" Down there with the rest of the strays, Alan dragged in. Wallace stood in the doorway, looking at the bowl, then at his daughter-in-law. She was 28, blonde, beautiful in the way that came from expensive salons and a personal trainer. Her eyes gleamed with anticipation, waiting for him to explode, to give her the reaction she could edit and spin into a story about his aggressive behavior or mental decline. He'd built houses that withstood hurricanes. He'd carved intricate designs into wood so hard it could break lesser tools. He'd held Elena's hand as she took her last breath and hadn't let himself break until the funeral was over and he was alone. He wasn't going to give Morgan Grimes the satisfaction of seeing him break now. Wallace walked slowly to the dog bowl, his knees protesting as he lowered himself to the floor. He picked up a piece of chicken with his fingers and ate it, maintaining eye contact with Morgan the entire time. Her smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction she'd wanted. He ate every scrap in that bowl, chewing slowly, deliberately. When he finished, he stood with the careful dignity of a man who understood that true power came from control, not reaction. "Thank you for dinner, Morgan," he said quietly. "It was delicious." He walked back to his room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of his bed. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear or humiliation, but from rage so pure and focused it felt like holding a lightning bolt. He took several deep breaths, the way Elena had taught him during her meditation phase. Then he pulled out a small notebook from his nightstand drawer. He'd been keeping it since the first month, documenting everything. Dates, times, behaviors, observations. A carpenter's precision applied to gathering evidence. He added a new entry, September 28th, dog bowl, recorded on phone. Alan, working late, confirmed via his assistant when I called earlier. Morgan's car had mud on the tires, unusual for someone coming from yoga in the city. Wallace had learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't hot and immediate. It was cold, calculated, and complete. You didn't just tear down a bad structure. You excavated the foundation, revealed what was rotten beneath, and built something better in its place. He flipped back through his notes. Months of observations. Patterns emerging like the grain and would revealing itself as you sanded away the surface. Morgan's Tuesday and Thursday absences. The expensive purchases that appeared in the house despite her supposed interior design business having no visible clients. The phone calls she'd taken hushed voices, always stepping outside. The way she'd started being extra affectionate with Alan whenever money was being discussed. And then there was the most interesting discovery, one he'd made just last week while taking out the trash. He'd found a bank statement, not from the joint account Alan had mentioned, but from something else. An account in Morgan's name only, with deposits that didn't match anything she should have been receiving. Wallace had photographed it with his phone before putting it back. Alan had taught him how to use the smartphone camera last Christmas, probably never imagining his father would put it to this use. Now, sitting in his sterile gray room, Wallace opened his phone and looked at that photograph again. The deposits came every month, always on the 15th. Always exactly $3,500. From an LLC he didn't recognize. He opened his laptop, another gift from Alan, meant to help him stay connected, and began to search. The LLC was registered in Delaware, which told him whoever set it up knew enough to want privacy. But privacy was just another puzzle to solve, and Wallace had patience. 3 hours later, he'd traced the LLC through several layers to a name: Phil Reese. Wallace sat back in his chair, pieces sliding into place. Phil Reese. He'd heard that name before. Morgan had mentioned her father was in real estate, always said with a particular emphasis that suggested she expected people to be impressed. He searched Phil Reese next. What he found made him smile for the first time in months. Phil Reese wasn't just in real estate. He owned Reese Development Corporation, a mid-sized firm that had made news 2 years ago for a controversial condo development that had displaced low-income families. The kind of man who smiled for charity photos while his lawyers found loopholes in housing regulations. And he was sending his daughter $3,500 a month. Why would a wealthy man need to send his married daughter a monthly allowance? Alan made a substantial salary. Morgan didn't work. The question itself revealed the answer. Phil Reese was paying for something. Information, perhaps. Or access. Wallace began searching for more information about Phil Reese and his wife. Helen McDowell Reese appeared in society pages, always photographed at charity galas, always wearing something expensive. The couple lived in a mansion in the old money part of the city, the kind of address that came with gates and security cameras. These were people who cared deeply about appearances, about status, about control. Morgan was their daughter, raised in that environment. Of course, she viewed Wallace as beneath her. Of course, she felt entitled to treat him like garbage. In her world, people were assets or obstacles, never just people. But here was the thing about people like the Reeses. Their armor was their image. Crack that, and everything underneath was soft and vulnerable. Wallace made more notes. He had a structure now, a plan beginning to form. But he needed more information. He needed to understand exactly what Morgan was doing on those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He needed to know what Phil Reese was paying for. And most importantly, he needed to know when Morgan's parents would next visit. Because when they did, Wallace would make sure they saw exactly what their daughter had become. He built his career on foundations. You couldn't create something lasting without first ensuring the base was solid. Morgan had built her life on lies, manipulation, and cruelty. Wallace was going to excavate that foundation and let everyone see what festered underneath. The dog bowl sat in his mind, a perfect symbol. Morgan thought she'd humiliated him. She didn't understand that she'd just given him the final piece of motivation he needed. Wallace Ritter had built his life with his hands, and now he would dismantle Morgan's lies with the same precision. The next morning, Wallace woke at 5:30, as he had every day for 50 years. The house was quiet. Alan already gone for an early meeting, Morgan still asleep after whatever she'd done the previous evening once Alan returned home. Wallace had heard them through the walls. Morgan's practiced enthusiasm, the sounds calculated to make Alan believe everything was perfect. Wallace made coffee in the kitchen, noting that Morgan had moved his preferred mug again. He found it in the back of a high cabinet, a petty inconvenience she probably giggled about. He used it anyway, taking his time with the morning ritual. By 7, he was in the garage, ostensibly working on a commission, a jewelry box for a client who'd found him through word of mouth. The box was walnut with maple inlays, intricate work that required absolute focus. But today his focus was split. At 7:30, his phone buzzed. A text from an old friend, Marcus Chun, who'd retired from carpentry but kept his hand in various trades. Coffee today? Got info on that thing you asked about. Wallace had called Marcus 2 days ago with a carefully casual question about private investigators. Marcus, who'd survived a messy divorce, had recommendations. 10 a.m., usual place. Wallace texted back. See you there. The usual place was a diner 3 blocks away, far enough that Morgan wouldn't see them if she happened to leave the house, close enough that Wallace could walk it easily. He'd been building his stamina back up, taking longer walks each week. Morgan hadn't noticed, but then Morgan noticed very little about him beyond opportunities for cruelty. At 9:45, Wallace cleaned his hands, put on his jacket, and left through the garage door. He'd learned to come and go this way, avoiding Morgan entirely. The autumn air was crisp, leaves just beginning to turn. Wallace had always loved this time of year. Elena had too. They'd taken long drives to see the foliage, stopped at farm stand for apple cider, lived the kind of simple life that seemed impossible now. Marcus was already at the diner, sitting in a corner booth with coffee and what looked like notes. He was 73, built like a fire hydrant, with a completely bald head and a handshake that could still crush fingers. "Wallace," he said, standing to embrace his old friend. "You look good. Better than last time I saw you." "I have a purpose now," Wallace said simply. Marcus laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling. "I knew that look. Same look you had when you were designing the Henderson house, determined to make it perfect. What's the daughter-in-law done now?" Wallace told him about the dog bowl. Marcus's face darkened. "Jesus, Wallace, you need to get out of there." "I will, but not until I've set things right." Wallace pulled out his phone, showing Marcus the photographs of the bank statement, his notes, everything he'd compiled. "I need to know what she's doing, where she goes, who she's meeting, everything." Marcus studied the information, his expression shifting from anger to something more calculating. "My guy's name is Vincent Vargas. Former cop, went private after he got tired of politics in the department. Discreet, thorough, and he owes me a favor." He slid a business card across the table. "Tell him I sent you. He'll give you the friends and family rate." "I can pay full price," Wallace said. "I know you can, but you'll need your money for what comes after." Marcus leaned forward. "Wallace, I've known you 40 years. I've never seen you like this. Whatever you're planning, make sure it's worth it." She served me dinner in a dog bowl and recorded it for entertainment. Marcus. My son stood there and said nothing because he wasn't home to see it. She's systematically trying to erase me from my own family. Wallace's voice was quiet but edged with steel. "I'm not planning revenge. I'm planning justice." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then do it right. Vargas will help." They talked for another hour, catching up on life, but Wallace's mind was already 3 steps ahead. By the time he walked back to the house, he had Vincent Vargas's number saved in his phone and a meeting scheduled for the following Monday. Morgan's car was gone when he returned, another Tuesday afternoon. Perfect. Wallace went to his room and pulled out a larger notebook, the kind architects use for detailed drawings. He began to sketch out a timeline, a plan with the precision he'd once applied to building houses. Every detail mattered. Every measurement had to be exact. Because when Morgan's parents came to visit, and they would, Morgan had mentioned it just last week, casually dropping that Mom and Dad want to see the house, with an undertone that suggested she was planning something. Wallace would be ready. He would show them exactly what their daughter was. And he would make sure everyone understood that old dogs had teeth. Vincent Vargas's office was above a bail bondsman in a part of town that had seen better days. Wallace climbed the narrow stairs, noting the water damage on the ceiling and the flickering fluorescent light. The door at the top had frosted glass with Vargas Investigations stenciled in black letters. Inside, the office was surprisingly tidy. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A desk sat beneath a window that overlooked the street, and 2 chairs faced each other across a small coffee table. The man who stood to greet Wallace was in his 50s, lean and alert, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes that cataloged everything in a single sweep. "Mr. Ritter," Vargas said, extending his hand. Marcus called ahead, said you need surveillance work. Wallace shook his hand and sat down. He brought his notebook, his phone with the photographs, everything organized. 20 minutes later, Vargas had heard the full story. "The dog bowl thing is cruel, but not illegal," Vargas said, making notes. "The question is what else she's doing. You mentioned regular Tuesday and Thursday absences, money from her father, suspicious behavior. What's your theory?" "I don't have enough information for a theory yet," Wallace said. "That's why I'm here." Vargas smiled slightly. "Most people come to me with theories, usually wrong ones. You come with data and questions. I like that." He pulled out a contract. "Standard surveillance package. I'll follow her Tuesday and Thursday for 2 weeks, document everything. Photos, video if relevant, location tracking. I'll also run background checks. Her parents, any associates that come up. Flat rate, $5,000 for 2 weeks of work." Wallace didn't hesitate. He'd saved carefully his entire life, and Elena's life insurance had left him comfortable. "When can you start?" "This Thursday. Give me her license plate, vehicle description, and her routine." Wallace provided everything from memory. Vargas's eyebrows rose slightly. You've been paying attention. I was a carpenter. Precision is how I survived. Wallace stood. One more thing. Her parents are visiting soon. I want to know everything about them before they arrive. Phil Reese and Helen McDowell Reese. Their business, their reputation, their vulnerabilities. That's extra research, but I can handle it. Give me 3 weeks total, $7,500, and you'll have a complete picture. They shook hands. Wallace wrote a check for half up front, the rest on delivery. As he left, Vargas called after him. Mr. Ritter, whatever you're planning, be smart about it. The best revenge is the kind they can't come back from. I know, Wallace said. That's exactly what I'm planning. That evening, Wallace returned to find Alan's car in the driveway, unusually early. Inside, he heard voices, Alan's tired baritone and Morgan's animated soprano. He paused in the garage, listening. My parents want to visit next month, Morgan was saying. We should make the house perfect. Maybe we could. The house is already perfect, honey. You've done an amazing job with it. But the garage is such a mess with all your father's stuff. Maybe we could clean it out? He doesn't really need a full workshop. Wallace's jaw tightened. She was coming for his last refuge. Dad loves that space, Alan said, and Wallace felt a small spark of hope. Let's leave it alone. Alan, baby, think about it. When Mom and Dad are here, they'll see the garage. It reflects on us. On you. Her voice had shifted to that particular tone, wheedling and sweet. Don't you want to make a good impression? A pause. Too long. Wallace knew that pause. Alan was considering it. We'll talk to Dad about organizing it better, Alan finally said. Wallace didn't wait to hear more. He walked in through the front door, making noise, and the conversation stopped instantly. Morgan appeared from the living room, her smile bright and fake. Wallace, we were just talking about you. I'm sure you were. He looked at his son, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. What can I help you with? Morgan's parents are visiting in 3 weeks, Alan said. October 21st through the 23rd. We were hoping you could maybe organize your workshop a bit, just to make a good impression. 3 weeks. Wallace filed that date away, his mind already adjusting timelines. Of course, he said mildly. I'll make sure everything is presentable. Morgan's smile widened, triumphant. She thought she'd won something. Wallace excused himself to his room, pulled out his phone, and texted Vargas. Need everything in 3 weeks. Parents visiting October 21st. This is the deadline. The response came quickly. Understood. I'll prioritize. Wallace sat on his bed, looking at the calendar. 3 weeks to gather evidence. 3 weeks to build the perfect trap. In carpentry, you measure twice and cut once. In life, Wallace was learning you watch carefully and strike precisely. Morgan wanted her parents to see a perfect house, a perfect life, a perfect daughter. Wallace would make sure they saw the truth instead. He pulled out his larger notebook and began to refine his plans. The foundation was set. Now he needed to frame the structure piece by piece until everything was ready to reveal. Old dogs didn't just eat from the floor. They knew how to bite. The first week of surveillance passed with agonizing slowness for Wallace, though he maintained his routine perfectly. He rose early, worked on his commissions in the garage, took walks, and endured Morgan's continued petty cruelties. She'd escalated since the dog bowl incident, perhaps emboldened by Alan's passive acceptance. His coffee was now consistently made with salt instead of sugar. His mail would arrive opened, scattered across the kitchen counter. She'd started parking her Mercedes so close to the garage door that Wallace had to squeeze through sideways, her laughter floating from the house when she heard him struggle. Alan noticed nothing, or perhaps he chose to notice nothing, which was somehow worse. On Thursday evening of that first week, Wallace's phone buzzed with a message from Vargas. Call me when you're alone. Wallace waited until late that night, when Alan and Morgan's bedroom door was closed and he could hear the television murmuring through the walls. He stepped into the garage, closed the door, and called. I've got preliminary findings, Vargas said without preamble. You were right to be suspicious. Your daughter-in-law isn't going to yoga. Where's she going? The Metropolitan Hotel. Downtown, expensive. She meets a man there. Same man, every Tuesday and Thursday. They check in at 2:15, check out at 5:30. Like clockwork. Wallace felt his jaw tighten. Do you know who he is? Still working on identification, but I've got photos. Sending them to your email now. Silver hair, expensive suits, drives a black BMW. I'm running his plates. Wallace opened his laptop, pulled up his email. The photos loaded. The man was perhaps 50, handsome in a manufactured way, with the kind of polish that came from money and careful maintenance. In one photo, he had his hand on Morgan's lower back as they entered the hotel. In another, they were kissing in the parking garage. There's more, Vargas continued. I followed the money angle. Those monthly deposits from Phil Reese? They started 8 months ago, right around the time Morgan and this mystery man's hotel visits began. You think her father knows about the affair? I think Phil Reese knows everything about his daughter. I've been digging into his background. The man is a control freak. He doesn't sneeze without calculating the optics. If he's sending money, there's a reason. What's his relationship with Alan? That's interesting. Reese apparently wasn't happy about the marriage initially. Thought Alan was beneath them. Decent lawyer, but not connected enough, not wealthy enough. But then Alan made partner at his firm 18 months ago, and suddenly Reese warmed up, started inviting them to events, introducing Alan to his business associates. Wallace processed this. Alan's connections became valuable. Exactly. Your son's firm handles corporate law, including real estate development. Reese Development has started using Alan's firm for their projects. I checked the public filings. The pieces were sliding together, forming a picture Wallace had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Morgan hadn't married Alan for love. She'd married him as an investment, one her father had eventually learned to capitalize on. The affair, Wallace said slowly. If it came out, if Alan divorced her, Reese loses access to Alan's firm and all those connections. Plus, depending on the prenup situation, Morgan might walk away with less than she wants. Vargas paused. There's one more thing. I did background on Helen McDowell Reese, Morgan's mother. Interesting family history there. Old money, very old. Her maiden name, McDowell, carries weight in certain circles. But her family lost most of their fortune 2 generations ago. Bad investments, typical rich people staying rich problems. So she married Phil Reese for his money. Looks like it. And Phil married her for her name and connections. It's a very transactional family, Mr. Ritter. Morgan learned from the best. After the call ended, Wallace sat in the dark garage, thinking. He'd wanted evidence of Morgan's cruelty, proof that would open Alan's eyes. Instead, he found something far more damaging, a systematic pattern of manipulation and betrayal. But the affair alone wouldn't be enough. Alan was in love, or thought he was. He might forgive infidelity, might convince himself it was his fault for working too much. People in denial could twist themselves into incredible shapes to avoid facing truth. No, Wallace needed more. He needed context. He needed the mystery man's identity. And he needed to understand exactly what game Phil and Helen Reese were playing. Most importantly, he needed to document everything so thoroughly that denial became impossible. Wallace returned to his room and updated his notebooks. Plans within plans, details stacking like the layers of a fine wood veneer. He'd built houses that stood for generations. He could build a revelation that would stand up to any scrutiny. By the end of week 2, Vargas had delivered his complete report. Wallace read it in his garage workshop, the pages spread across his workbench like blueprints. The mystery man was Julian Wright, 49, owner of Wright Commercial Properties. He wasn't just Morgan's lover. He was also one of Phil Reese's business partners. They co-owned several commercial buildings downtown, had joint ventures in 3 states, which meant Phil Reese almost certainly knew about the affair, might have even encouraged it. Wallace read through financial record Vargas had obtained. Morgan had a separate credit card that Julian Wright paid for. Luxury items, restaurants, weekend trips Alan knew nothing about. The Metropolitan Hotel wasn't their only meeting place. They'd been to New York twice, Miami once, always when Alan was traveling for work. Your daughter-in-law is playing a long game, Vargas had written in his summary notes. She maintains the marriage for legitimacy and access to Alan's professional network. Julian Wright provides the lifestyle and excitement she wants. Phil Reese orchestrates it all, keeping everyone in their assigned roles. The monthly payments to Morgan might be hush money or a salary for corporate espionage. She has access to Alan's work files, his laptop, confidential client information. That last part made Wallace's blood run cold. Alan worked on sensitive cases. If Morgan was feeding information to her father and Julian Wright, Alan could be disbarred, could face criminal charges. His son wasn't just being betrayed. He was being used, potentially criminally. Wallace made copies of everything, stored them in multiple places, a safety deposit box he'd rented, a cloud storage account, physical copies hidden in his workshop. Then he began planning the final stage. Phil and Helen Reese would arrive in 4 days, expecting to see their daughter's perfect life. Instead, Wallace would show them what their daughter really was, and make them complicit in her exposure. Because the key wasn't just revealing Morgan's sins. It was making sure everyone understood that her parents had raised her to be exactly what she'd become. The Reeses built their empire on manipulation and moral flexibility. Wallace would use their own tools against them. He spent the next 3 days preparing, working with the focus of a master craftsman on his final project. He contacted Claudia Potts, a lawyer friend of Elena's who specialized in family law. He arranged for documents to be notarized. He even reached out to Joshua Giles, a journalist who'd written critically about Phil Reese's business practices. Every piece had to be in place. Every measurement had to be exact. On the morning of October 21st, Wallace woke early as always. Through his window, he could see Morgan's car already gone, probably picking up her parents from their hotel. She'd insisted they stay at the Metropolitan Hotel rather than the house, which was rich with irony given what that hotel meant to her secret life. Alan had taken the day off, something he rarely did. He was downstairs now, nervous, wanting everything perfect. Wallace almost felt sorry for his son. Almost. He dressed carefully, clean slacks, a button-down shirt, his good watch. He wanted to look like exactly what he was, a man of dignity and purpose. When he came downstairs, Alan was pacing in the kitchen. "Dad, thank you for organizing the garage. And for being understanding about everything." "Of course, son." Wallace poured coffee, using his favorite mug that Morgan had mysteriously stopped hiding. A small slip in her facade, perhaps. Confidence making her careless. "I wanted A to go well. Morgan's parents are..." Alan hesitated. "They're particular. Her mother especially. Just, if they seem a bit formal." "I understand, Alan. I'll be on my best behavior." The relief on his son's face was painful to see. At 11 o'clock, Morgan's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Wallace watched from the living room window as she emerged, followed by her parents. Phil Reese was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and resort vacations. He wore a blazer and slacks that probably cost more than Wallace's first car. His handshake would be firm, Wallace knew. Men like Phil always had firm handshakes. Helen McDowell Reese was thin in the way that required serious effort. Her blonde hair, styled perfectly, her dress elegant and probably designer. She moved with the careful grace of someone always conscious of being watched. They looked exactly like the kind of people who would raise a daughter like Morgan. Wallace stood in the entryway as they came in, noting how Alan straightened his posture, how Morgan's smile was different around her parents, sharper, more calculated. "Mom, Dad, this is my father, Wallace Ritter," Alan said. Phil's handshake was indeed firm, his smile professionally warm. "Wallace, good to finally meet you. Morgan's told us so much." "I'm sure she has," Wallace said mildly. Helen offered her hand delicately, as if expecting it to be kissed rather than shaken. "What a lovely home," she said, her eyes already scanning, cataloging, judging. "Morgan designed it," Alan said proudly. "It shows," Helen replied, which could have meant anything. They moved to the living room, Morgan playing hostess with practiced ease. She'd prepared lunch, or rather, she'd had it catered and arranged it to look homemade. Wallace noticed these details now, the small deceptions that painted her life. Over lunch, Phil dominated the conversation, talking about a new development project, asking Alan pointed questions about the legal aspects. Alan answered carefully, professionally. Wallace watched Morgan watch her father, saw the small nod of approval when Alan said something particularly useful. It was a performance, all of it. A carefully orchestrated dance where everyone knew their role except Alan. "So, Wallace," Helen said, turning her attention to him with the air of someone completing a social obligation. "Morgan mentioned you live here now. How are you finding it?" "It's been educational," Wallace said. "I've learned a great deal about my daughter-in-law." Morgan's smile flickered, just slightly, but Wallace saw it. "Dad's been wonderful," she said quickly. "So helpful with little projects around the house." "I'm sure," Helen said dismissively, already looking away. The afternoon proceeded with the same artificial pleasantness. Tour of the house, admiration of Morgan's decorating choices, Phil making pointed comments about property values and investment potential. They saved the garage for last. "This is Dad's workshop," Alan said, opening the door with genuine pride. "He's a master carpenter. Built half the houses in our old neighborhood." Wallace had indeed organized it perfectly. Every tool in place, the workbench clean, his current project, a cedar chest, prominently displayed. But he'd added something extra. On a side table, arranged carefully, were several items. A dog bowl, photographs, documents, and a laptop, screen open, paused on a video. "What's all this?" Phil asked, his businessman's eye catching the unusual display immediately. "This," Wallace said calmly, "is what I prepared for Morgan. What I wanted her parents to see." Morgan had gone very still. Alan looked confused. Helen's expression was pure aristocratic disdain. Only Phil seemed to understand that something had shifted, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to the table. Wallace picked up the dog bowl first. "3 weeks ago, your daughter served me dinner in this. Told me old dogs eat from the floor. She recorded it on her phone for entertainment." "Dad," Alan started. "Let me finish, son." Wallace's voice was gentle but immovable. He picked up a photograph. "These are surveillance photos from the Metropolitan Hotel. Your daughter meets Julian right there every Tuesday and Thursday. They've been having an affair for 8 months." The silence was absolute. Morgan's face had gone white. Alan looked like he'd been struck. Helen's mouth had fallen open slightly. Phil Reese, interestingly, looked angry but not surprised. "You hired a private investigator?" Morgan's voice was shrill. "You crazy old man." "I documented evidence," Wallace corrected, "which is what you do when you see a crime being committed." He picked up another set of documents. "These are bank records showing monthly payments from Phil Reese to Morgan. $3,500 a month, starting exactly when the affair began." He turned to Phil directly. "You're paying your daughter. The question is what for? My investigator thinks it might be corporate espionage. Morgan has access to Alan's work files, confidential client information. Julian Wright is your business partner. How many of Alan's clients have mysteriously ended up working with you instead?" Alan had stood up, his face cycling through emotions, confusion, denial, dawning horror. "Morgan, tell me this isn't true." But Morgan wasn't looking at Alan. She was looking at her father, and Wallace saw the silent communication between them. This was a disaster, but it was also familiar territory. They would lie, they would spin, they would... And before anyone tries to deny it, Wallace said, pressing play on a laptop, "I have video." The screen showed Morgan and Julian Wright in the hotel parking garage, kissing, laughing, his hands on her body. The timestamp was from 3 days ago, while Alan had been in Boston for a deposition. "You son of a bitch," Morgan hissed at Wallace, her mask completely dropped now. "You had no right." "I had every right," Wallace said quietly. "I'm a father watching his son be betrayed. I'm a man who was treated like garbage in his own son's home while you played happy housewife. You humiliated me. You recorded it for fun. Did you think I would just accept that?" "I want him out," Morgan said, turning to Alan. "Today. Now. I want that senile old man out of our house." But Alan wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at his father, and Wallace saw the moment his son's willful blindness finally cracked. "Is all of this true?" Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every word," Wallace said. "I have more documentation if you need it. Financial records, hotel receipts, timeline analysis. I've also contacted Claudia Potts. She has copies of everything, held in escrow. If anything happens to me, if I have any kind of accident, it all goes public." He turned to Phil and Helen. "You raise your daughter to be exactly what she is. A manipulator. A user. someone who sees people as tools. She learned it from watching you. Phil's face had gone red. You don't know anything about my family. I know your business has mysteriously acquired 3 of Alan's former clients in the past year. I know Julian Wright has been sharing confidential information with you. I know your daughter married my son because you told her to, because you saw an opportunity. Wallace's voice hardened. And I know that when this all comes out, and it will come out, your reputation, your business, everything you've built on manipulation and connections will come crashing down. You're threatening us? Helen's voice was icy. I'm explaining consequences. Wallace looked at each of them in turn. Here's what's going to happen. Morgan will move out today. She'll sign divorce papers with a prenup that ensures she gets nothing beyond what she brought into this marriage. Alan will review every case, every file she had access to, and report any evidence of information sharing to the Bar Association. And if we refuse? Phil demanded. Wallace smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. Then I release everything. The affair, the financial records, the evidence of corporate espionage. I've already spoken with Joshua Giles at the Tribune. He's very interested in a story about Phil Reese using his daughter to steal from his business partner's son-in-law. I imagine the ethics investigation alone would tie you up for years. You can't prove corporate espionage, Phil said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Maybe not criminally, but I can prove the affair, the payments, and the pattern of Alan's clients ending up in your pocket. I can make your life very difficult, Phil. And unlike you, I have nothing to lose. I'm a 71-year-old widower. My reputation is I'm a good carpenter and a good man. What's yours? The garage was silent except for the sound of Morgan crying. Angry, frustrated tears, not remorse. Helen had her arms around her daughter, but her eyes were calculating, already working the angles. Alan stood apart from all of them, staring at Wallace like he was seeing his father for the first time. Son, Wallace said gently, I'm sorry you had to learn about this today. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. But she would have denied it, and you would have believed her. You needed to see the evidence. You knew for weeks, Alan said. You lived here, watching me be a fool. You're not a fool. You're a good man who wanted to believe the best of his wife. But she wasn't worthy of that trust. Wallace stepped closer to his son. Your mother would have wanted me to protect you, even from your own choices. Alan's eyes were wet. Did Mom know? About Morgan? She suspected. 3 months before she died, she told me Morgan had a smile like a shark. Something broke in Alan's face. He turned to Morgan, and when he spoke, his voice was cold. Get out. Alan, baby, let me explain. Morgan started. I said get out. Today. Now. Take whatever you can carry. The rest can be shipped to your parents' house. You can't just throw me out. Morgan's voice rose to a shriek. I have rights. This is my house too. Actually, Wallace said, pulling out another document. According to the deed, this house is in Alan's name only. You have no legal claim to it. And given the evidence of adultery, I don't think you'll find a judge sympathetic to your position. Phil stepped forward, his businessman's mask firmly in place. Let's all calm down. I'm sure we can work something out that's beneficial to everyone. The only thing I want, Alan said, his voice shaking with controlled rage, is for your daughter to be gone, and for you to leave my father alone. Forever. Wallace had never been prouder of his son than in that moment. The next hour was chaos. Morgan screaming, Helen trying to salvage the situation with cold reasoning, Phil making veiled threats that Wallace deflected with calm reminders of the evidence he possessed. Alan stood firm, a steel Wallace hadn't known existed in his son finally revealed. In the end, Morgan left with 2 suitcases and her parents, shouting threats about lawyers and revenge. The door slammed behind them, and suddenly the house was quiet. Alan sat down on the garage floor, his head in his hands. Wallace sat beside him, the way he used to when Alan was a boy and the world seemed overwhelming. I'm sorry, Dad, Alan said finally, for not seeing it, for letting her treat you like that, for being so blind. You loved her. Love makes us blind sometimes. It's not weakness, it's hope. Wallace put his arm around his son's shoulders. But now you see clearly, and you were strong enough to act. The dog bowl, Alan said, his voice breaking. She made you eat from a dog bowl, and I wasn't even there to stop it. If you'd been there, I wouldn't have the evidence I needed. She gave me the motivation to look deeper, and what I found saved you from years of being used. Wallace squeezed his son's shoulder. Everything happens for a reason, even the painful things. They sat there for a long time, father and son, in the garage that had become Wallace's sanctuary. Outside, autumn leaves fell from the trees, and somewhere across the city, Morgan Grimes was realizing that underestimating an old man had been the biggest mistake of her life. The next 2 months moved with surprising speed. Morgan tried to fight the divorce, hiring an expensive lawyer her father paid for, but Wallace's evidence was overwhelming. The prenup Alan had insisted on before marriage, something Morgan had signed while drunk on champagne and confident in her manipulations, held firm. She walked away with nothing but her car and her clothes. Phil Reese tried to intimidate Alan into dropping any investigation into corporate espionage, but Alan had discovered enough in his files to make a formal complaint to his firm's ethics board. 3 of his cases showed evidence of information leaks. The firm launched an internal investigation, and while criminal charges never materialized, Phil Reese found himself quietly removed from several boards and business associations. The whispers alone damaged his reputation beyond repair. Julian Wright's wife filed for divorce 2 weeks after the revelation, taking half of his commercial property empire and his BMW in the settlement. Helen McDowell Reese stopped appearing at charity galas. The family that had built everything on appearances found those appearances destroyed by their own daughter's actions. Morgan herself moved to California. According to the private investigator Wallace, kept on retainer for 3 months just to ensure she wasn't planning revenge. Last he heard, she was working as an actual interior designer, her social media presence scrubbed of any mention of her marriage or her family. Alan threw himself into work at first, processing the betrayal through 18-hour days and weekend depositions. But gradually, with Wallace's gentle encouragement, he began to heal. They had dinner together every night now, really talked, rebuilt the relationship that Morgan had slowly poisoned. One evening in late December, as they sat in the living room, redecorated now, warmer, with furniture that was meant to be lived in, Alan turned to his father. "I've been thinking about selling this house. Too many bad memories. Maybe we could find something together. A place with a workshop for you, an office for me. Start fresh." Wallace smiled. "I like that, son. Dad, can I ask you something?" Alan's voice was hesitant. "That day in the garage, when you showed them everything, you were so calm, so prepared. How long had you been planning it?" Since the moment she put that dog bowl on the floor, Wallace said honestly, "She thought she'd broken me. She didn't understand that humiliation doesn't break you. It clarifies things. It showed me exactly who she was and what needed to be done. You could have just told me. Would you have believed me without proof?" Alan was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "I would have thought you were being paranoid, or jealous of my marriage, or struggling with grief from losing Mom." "Exactly. Some truths have to be seen to be believed." Wallace looked at his son. "I'm sorry it had to be so dramatic, but I needed to make sure you saw everything, that her parents saw what they created, that there was no way to spin it or deny it. You destroyed her entire family in one afternoon." "I revealed what they'd already built," Wallace corrected. "They destroyed themselves through their choices. I just made sure everyone could see the foundation they'd been hiding." Alan laughed, though it was tinged with sadness. "Mom always said you thought 3 moves ahead. I never really understood what she meant until now. Your mother was a wise woman." Wallace raised his glass. Good whiskey, the kind Elena used to buy him for special occasions. "To Eleanor Ritter, who taught me that love means protecting the people who matter, even when they can't see the danger themselves." "To Mom," Alan echoed, clinking glasses. They sat in comfortable silence, watching snow begin to fall outside. Somewhere across the city, Morgan Grimes was living with the consequences of underestimating an old man. Phil and Helen Reese were explaining to their social circle why they'd suddenly become unavailable for events. Julian Wright was signing away half his fortune, and Wallace Ritter sat with his son in a house that would soon become just a memory, planning a future built on honesty instead of manipulation. He'd spent 40 years as a carpenter, learning that the strength of any structure came from its foundation. Morgan had built her life on lies, and when Wallace pulled away the facade, everything collapsed. Some might call it revenge. Wallace thought of it as renovation, tearing down what was rotten and building something better in its place. Old dogs, he'd learned, didn't just eat from the floor. They knew exactly when and where to bite. And when they did, they made sure everyone remembered it. 6 months later, Wallace stood in the workshop of the new house. A beautiful craftsman-style home they'd found in the suburbs, with a proper 2-car garage converted into a professional workspace. Alan's office was upstairs, sunny and spacious. They'd moved in together, 2 men rebuilding their relationship from a foundation of honesty. Wallace was working on a commission, an intricate dining table for a young couple expecting their first child. The work was meditative, satisfying in the way only creation could be. His phone buzzed. A text from Vincent Vargas, who'd become something of a friend. Thought you'd want to know. Morgan Grimes Ritter filed for bankruptcy last month. Medical debt. Her parents cut her off completely. Wallace read the message twice, then set his phone down. He felt no joy in Morgan's misfortune, but no guilt either. She'd made her choices. She'd built her life on using people, and when those people were gone, she had nothing left to stand on. He returned to sanding the table, the rhythm familiar and comforting. Outside, he could hear Alan on a phone call, laughing at something colleagues said. His son was healing, slowly becoming the man he was meant to be before Morgan had tried to reshape him into a tool for her family's ambitions. The table was taking shape beautifully. Cherry wood with maple accents, traditional joinery that would last for generations. The couple who'd commissioned it would pass it down to their children, who would pass it to theirs, a legacy built with care and precision. Wallace had built his legacy too, though it looked different than he'd expected. Not in houses or furniture, but in the protection of his son, in the exposure of cruelty, in a reminder that dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but how you responded to that treatment. Eleanor would have approved. She'd always said that the measure of a person wasn't in how they handled success, but in how they handled injustice. Wallace had handled it with the same precision he brought to every craft. Measure twice, cut once, and make sure the foundation was solid before building anything upon it. He finished sanding the table leg, checked it for smoothness, and smiled. Perfect, just as it should be. Outside, spring was turning to summer, and somewhere across the city, Morgan Grimes was learning what it meant to face the world without manipulation, without her parents' money, without anyone to use. Wallace hoped, in some distant part of his mind, that she learned something from it, that she became better. But that was her journey now, not his concern. His concern was the table before him, the sun upstairs, and the life they were building together, honest, solid, and made to last. Just like everything Wallace Ritter had ever created with his own 2 hands. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab. Now let's begin. The afternoon sun cut through the windshield as Titus Bridges pulled his truck into the parking lot of Riverside Elementary. He killed the engine and checked his watch. 3:15. School let out in 10 minutes. His sister-in-law Tamika would throw a fit if she knew he was here again, but Titus didn't care much for Tamika's opinions. He'd been picking up his nephew Owen once a week for the past 3 months, ever since the boy had shown up at his doorstep with a bruise the size of a tangerine on his arm. Owen had said he fell off his bike. The bruise was shaped like fingers. Titus was 34 years old, 6'2", with the kind of quiet intensity that made people cross to the other side of the street. He'd spent 8 years as a wildland firefighter before a collapsing timber took out his knee. Now he ran a small contracting business and tried to keep his head above water financially. He wasn't rich, wasn't powerful, wasn't connected, but he was patient, and he noticed things other people missed. The school bell rang, and children poured out of the building like water from a broken dam. Titus scanned the crowd for Owen's sandy hair and the worn blue backpack he'd bought him last Christmas. Minutes passed. The crowd thinned. No Owen. He walked to the front office, where a receptionist with tired eyes looked up from her computer. "I'm here to pick up Owen Bridges. Third grade, Mrs. Patterson's class." The woman typed something, frowned, typed again. "Owen hasn't been in school since Tuesday." His mother called him out. "Family emergency," she said. "Tuesday? That was 3 days ago. Did she say what kind of emergency?" "I'm sorry, sir. We can't share that information." Titus thanked her and walked back to his truck. He sat there for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Then he pulled out his phone and called his brother. Marlon answered on the 5th ring. "Titus, what do you want? Where's Owen?" A pause. "What do you mean, where's Owen?" He's at school." "No, he isn't. The school says he's been out since Tuesday." "What's going on, Marlon?" "Nothing's going on. Marlon's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Look, I can't talk right now. Tamika is in the other room. Owen's fine, okay? He ran away. We've been looking for him." "Ran away?" "He's 8 years old. Kids do stupid things. He's probably hiding at a friend's house, trying to scare us. He'll come back when he gets hungry. Have you called the police?" Another pause, longer this time. "Tamika doesn't want to involve them. She says it'll just traumatize him more when he comes home." "Look, I have to go." The line went dead. Titus stared at the phone in his hand. His brother had always been the weaker one, the one who bent like grass in the wind. When they were kids, Marlon would hide behind Titus whenever trouble came around. When their parents died in a car accident 10 years ago, Marlon had fallen apart while Titus handled the funeral arrangements, the estate, everything. And when Marlon met Tamika Solis at some charity gala and got swept up in her beauty and her family's money, Titus had kept his mouth shut even though something about her set his teeth on edge. Tamika came from old wealth, the kind that had tentacles reaching into every corner of the city. Her father, Cleveland Solis, had made his fortune in real estate development, and the family treated everyone outside their circle like servants. Marlon had married into money, but he'd paid for it with his spine. Titus started the truck and drove to their house. The Bridges residence sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in the nicest neighborhood in town, a 3-story colonial revival with a manicured lawn and a Mercedes in the driveway. Titus had always hated this house. It looked like a photograph in a magazine, beautiful, perfect, and completely lifeless. He parked on a street and walked up the front path. The doorbell chimed a melody that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Tamika opened the door. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse, and her hair was pulled back in an elegant twist. She looked like she was heading to a wine tasting, not like a mother whose child had been missing for 3 days. "Titus." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise. I want to see Owen." "I'm afraid that's not possible. He's not here. Marlon said he ran away. I want to help look for him." "That's very sweet, but we have it under control." She started to close the door. "I'll have Marlon call you when." Titus put his hand against the door. "When did you last see him?" Something flickered in her eyes. "Fear?" "No, not quite. Something colder. Tuesday morning, before school. He got upset about something and ran off. You know how dramatic children can be." "What did he get upset about?" "I really don't see how that's any of your business. He's my nephew, and he's my son, which means I get to decide who helps and who doesn't." She pushed against the door. "Now if you'll excuse me." Titus stepped back and let the door close. He stood there for a moment, looking at the perfectly painted facade, then walked around the side of the house toward the backyard. The fence was 6 feet high, but there was a gate near the garage. It was locked, but Titus had learned a long time ago that expensive locks meant nothing if you knew where to apply pressure. The gate swung open with a quiet click. The backyard was as immaculate as the front. A covered patio, a swimming pool gleaming turquoise in the afternoon sun, and a stretch of grass that looked like it had been cut with scissors. Beyond the lawn, at the very back of the property, there was a small gardening shed surrounded by rose bushes. And next to the shed, a patch of earth that didn't match the rest. Titus walked toward it, his boots quiet on the grass. The patch was maybe 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and the dirt was darker than the surrounding soil. Looser, as if it had been recently turned. He knelt down and pressed his palm against the earth. It was soft, almost spongy, and there, at the edge of the disturbed ground, he saw something that made his blood freeze. a small handprint, pressed into the dirt near the surface, as if someone had been trying to push their way out. Titus went still. Every sound seemed amplified. The birds in the trees, the distant hum of traffic, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then he heard it, a scratching sound, faint, rhythmic, coming from underground. He didn't think. He dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands, tearing at the soil like a man possessed. The dirt was loose, thankfully recently turned, and he made progress fast. 6 inches down, a foot, 2 feet. His fingers touched something. Fabric, a shirt. He cleared more earth and saw a face. Owen's face, pale and dirty, his eyes closed, his lips cracked and blue-tinged. For one horrible moment, Titus thought he was too late. Then Owen's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak, rasping breath. "Uncle Titus?" "I'm here, buddy. I'm here." Titus kept digging, clearing the dirt from Owen's shoulders, his chest, his arms. The boy was curled in a fetal position in a shallow grave, and Titus realized with sick horror that there was a wooden crate over him, something that had created an air pocket, keeping him alive. He ripped the crate aside and pulled Owen out of the ground, cradling the boy against his chest. Owen was shaking, his small fingers gripping Titus's shirt like a lifeline. "They tried to," Owen whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mommy and Daddy, they tried to." "Chill. I've got you. You're safe now." Owen's eyes went wide, looking at something over Titus's shoulder. "Uncle Titus." Titus turned. Tamika stood 10 feet away, between him and the gate. In her hand was a shovel, the blade gleaming in the fading afternoon light. "You should have minded your own business, Titus," she said. The world narrowed to a single point, the woman standing between him and freedom, her grip steady on the shovel's handle. Titus had dealt with dangerous situations before, collapsing structures, walls of flame, panic-stricken victims. But this was different. This was calculated malice wearing an expensive blouse. "Put the boy down," Tamika said, "and we can discuss this like adults." Owen whimpered against Titus's chest. The boy was trembling so hard that Titus could feel his small bones rattling. "Discuss what?" Titus kept his voice level, buying time, assessing angles. "How you buried your 8-year-old son alive in your backyard." "He's not my son." The words came out flat, empty. "I finally got the DNA results last month. Marlon had an affair 9 years ago with some waitress. Owen is the product of that affair. The waitress died when he was a baby, and Marlon brought him home and convinced me to raise him as my own. Can you imagine? I spent 8 years pretending to love another woman's child. So you decided to kill him?" "I decided to solve a problem." Tamika took a step closer. "Without Owen, everything becomes simpler. The inheritance, the social obligations, all of it." Marlon agreed it was for the best. Marlon agreed to murder his own son. Marlon agrees to whatever I tell him to agree to. He always has. She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Titus had ever seen. "Now put the boy down. This doesn't have to be messy." Titus's mind raced. He was bigger, stronger, but she had a weapon and he was carrying a child. If he tried to rush her, she could swing for Owen. If he tried to run, she could catch him before he reached the gate. The fence was too high to climb while holding the boy. But Tamika didn't know everything about him. She didn't know about the years he'd spent training to keep calm in impossible situations. She didn't know about the small knife he kept clipped to his belt, hidden beneath his shirt. "I'm going to set him down," Titus said, lowering himself slowly to one knee. "Don't do anything stupid." Tamika's eyes tracked his movement, her grip tightening on the shovel. Titus placed Owen gently on the grass, positioning his body between the boy and the threat. "Owen," he said quietly, "when I say run, you go to the neighbor's house. The green one with the white fence. You bang on the door, and you don't stop until someone answers. Understand?" Owen nodded, his eyes huge and frightened. Titus straightened up, keeping his hands visible. "Okay, Tamika, let's discuss this." She frowned. "Discuss what? How are you going to let us walk out of here?" Titus took a casual step to the left, drawing her attention away from Owen. "Because if you don't, things are going to get very unpleasant for you. You're hardly in a position to make threats." "No." You think you can kill me and a child and explain that away? You think your money will cover up two bodies? It's covered up worse. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her voice. Another step to the left. See, that's where you're wrong. I'm not some random victim you could dispose of. I told 3 people where I was going tonight. My business partner, my neighbor, and a detective friend who owes me a favor. If I don't check in within the hour, they're going to come looking. A lie. But Tamika didn't know that. She hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Titus moved. He didn't go for her. He went for the shovel. His hand shot out and grabbed the handle just below the blade, twisting it sharply to the side. Tamika yelped and lost her grip. Titus tore the shovel from her hands and threw it across the yard in one smooth motion. "Run," he shouted. Owen sprinted for the gate like his life depended on it, because it did. Tamika lunged after him, but Titus caught her around the waist and threw her to the ground. She screamed, a high, furious sound, and clawed at his face. Her nails raked across his cheek, drawing blood. Titus pinned her down, one knee on her back, one hand pressing her face into the grass. "Stay down." "Marlon," she screamed. "Marlon." The back door burst open and Marlon stumbled out, his face pale and sweating. He saw the empty grave, his wife pinned to the ground, and his brother bleeding from 3 parallel scratches on his face. "What did you do?" Marlon's voice cracked. "Titus, what did you do?" "What did I do?" Titus stared at his brother in disbelief. "You tried to murder your son, Marlon. Your own son." "He's not." Marlon stopped, looking like he might be sick. "She said it was the only way. She said if I didn't help, she'd divorce me and take everything. I'd be left with nothing. So you buried him alive?" "We gave him a crate. We were going to dig him up in a few hours, make it look like he's suffocated by accident. Nobody would have known. He's 8 years old, Marlon." Titus's voice broke. "He's a kid, our parents' grandchild, and you put him in the ground like garbage." Marlon started crying. Big, ugly sobs that shook his entire body. "I didn't have a choice. She controls everything. The money, the house, everything. If I left her, I'd have nothing." Tamika spoke from beneath Titus's knee, her voice muffled but venomous. "Stop sniveling, you pathetic." Titus pressed harder, cutting off her words. Then he looked at his brother, the man he'd grown up with, protected, loved despite everything, and felt something inside him die. "You had a choice," Titus said quietly. "You just made the wrong one." He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The police arrived in waves. Patrol cars first, then detectives, then crime scene technicians with cameras and evidence bags. Owen was wrapped in a blanket and placed in an ambulance, his small hand gripping Titus's fingers until the paramedics gently pried them apart. "We'll take care of him," one of them said. "He's dehydrated and in shock, but he's going to be okay." Titus watched the ambulance pull away, its lights painting the gathering dusk in red and blue. Then he turned back to the chaos in the backyard. Tamika was in handcuffs, screaming about lawyers and lawsuits, and how everyone involved would regret this. Marlon was in handcuffs too, but he wasn't screaming. He was just standing there, staring at the grave where his son had almost died, looking like a man who'd finally realized what he'd become. A detective approached Titus, a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Bridges? I'm Detective Marion Atkinson. I need to take your statement." Titus nodded and told her everything, from the missed pickup at school to the discovery in the backyard. When he finished, Detective Atkinson was quiet for a long moment. "You saved that boy's life," she finally said. "If you hadn't come when you did. I know, we're going to need you to testify. This is going to be a complicated case. Mrs. Bridges' family has money and connections. They'll hire the best lawyers, try to make this go away." Titus looked at Tamika being loaded into a patrol car, her face twisted with fury. Then he looked at his brother, who wouldn't meet his eyes. "It's not going to go away," Titus said. "I won't let it." The next 3 weeks were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Owen was physically recovering. The doctor said the crate had saved his life. It had created enough of an air pocket that he could breathe, barely, for the 3 days he was underground. He'd suffered dehydration, mild hypothermia, and psychological trauma that would take years to process. Titus visited every day. He brought coloring books and action figures and sat by Owen's bed for hours, not talking, just being there. Sometimes Owen would wake from nightmares screaming, and Titus would hold him until the shaking stopped. I heard them talking. Owen said one afternoon, his voice small, before they put me in the ground. Mommy said I was a loose end. She said Grandpa Cleveland would make sure nobody ever found out. Titus went very still. Grandpa Cleveland? Owen nodded. He was there. He brought the crate. He said it was better this way. Cleveland Solis, Tamika's father, one of the most powerful men in the city. Titus felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. If Cleveland was involved, this was bigger than he'd imagined. And suddenly, Tamika's confidence made sense. She wasn't worried about prison because she didn't expect to go to prison. Her father would make sure of that. He left the hospital and drove to the county jail where Tamika was being held pending bail. The visiting room was sterile and cold, divided by glass partitions and monitored by cameras. Tamika looked different in the orange jumpsuit. Smaller, somehow. But when she saw Titus, her smile was the same, cold and confident. "Come to gloat?" she asked through the speaker. "Owen told me about your father." The smile flickered. "Just for a second. My father hasn't done anything. He brought the crate. He helped you plan this." "Prove it." "I will." Tamika laughed. "You're adorable. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? My family built this city. We own the police, the judges, the prosecutors. This little inconvenience will be cleared up within a month, and then..." She leaned closer to the glass. "Then we're going to finish what we started. Owen, anyone who gets in the way. My father doesn't leave loose ends." Titus stared at her through the glass. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, something fundamental shifted. He'd been thinking like a victim, relying on the system to deliver justice. But the system was broken. The system was bought and paid for. He would have to deliver justice himself. "Good talk," he said and walked out. The Solis family operated like a well-oiled machine of corruption. In the 2 weeks following Tamika's arrest, Titus watched helplessly as their influence spread like poison through the legal system. The first judge assigned to the case recused herself. Personal conflicts, she said, though she'd never met the Solis family before. The second judge set bail at $50,000, a slap on the wrist for attempted murder. Tamika walked out of jail on a Wednesday afternoon and was photographed smiling on the courthouse steps. Evidence began to disappear. The wooden crate that had kept Owen alive, lost in a storage facility fire. Security footage from the Bridges home showing the burial. Corrupted files, the police said. The original officer who took Titus's statement transferred to a precinct 300 miles away. Detective Atkinson called him one evening, her voice heavy with frustration. "I'm doing everything I can, but every time I make progress, something blocks me." Witnesses change their stories. Documents vanish. "I've been a cop for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Cleveland Solis. "I can't prove it. And without proof, I'm just another cop making accusations against a pillar of the community." She paused. "I'm sorry, Titus. I believe you, but belief isn't evidence." After she hung up, Titus sat in his living room, staring at the wall. Owen was asleep in the spare bedroom. The court had granted Titus temporary custody pending the trial, which was something at least. But the trial was looking more and more like a formality. The Solis family was going to walk, unless Titus stopped them. He spent the next week researching. Not the crimes themselves, the family. Cleveland Solis had built his empire on real estate, but real estate was just the visible tip of the iceberg. Underneath were layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and business partners who had a tendency to die in convenient accidents. One name kept appearing, Casey Huffman. He'd been Cleveland's accountant for 15 years until he disappeared 5 years ago. Official story was that he'd embezzled money and fled to avoid prosecution. But Titus dug deeper and found that Casey's wife and daughter had also disappeared, and that no charges had ever actually been filed. He tracked down Casey's brother, a mechanic named Trey George who ran a shop on the outskirts of town. Trey was cautious at first, but when Titus explained about Owen, something shifted in his eyes. "I knew something was wrong," Trey said, wiping grease from his hands. Casey would never abandon his family. He was the most honest man I ever knew. When Cleveland Solis came after him, I told him to run. But he said he couldn't. He said Cleveland had done something terrible, something he had proof of, and he was going to take him down. What kind of proof? I don't know exactly. But Casey had a safe deposit box. A backup, he called it, in case something happened to him. Trey pulled a small key from his pocket. He gave this to me before he disappeared. Told me to only use it if he didn't come back. I was scared, so I never did. But if you're really going to take these people down... He pressed the key into Titus's palm. Maybe it's time. The safe deposit box was at a small bank in a neighboring county. Titus arrived the next morning with the key and his heart hammering in his chest. The contents were a single flash drive, unmarked, and a handwritten note. Cleveland Solis killed 4 people to secure the Riverside development deal in 2018. The victims were contractors who threatened to expose construction fraud. Their bodies are buried beneath Building 7. This drive contains financial records, witness statements, and GPS coordinates. If I'm dead, make sure this reaches someone who can't be bought. Casey. Titus stared at the note for a long time. Then he plugged the flash drive into his laptop and began to read. The files were meticulous. Casey Huffman had been more than an accountant. He'd been a documentarian of Cleveland Solis's crimes. Financial transactions showing payments to hitmen. Forged inspection reports. Testimony from a construction worker who'd witnessed the murders before fleeing the state. But the most damning evidence was the simplest. GPS coordinates and ground-penetrating radar scans showing anomalies beneath Building 7 of the Riverside Development Complex. Anomalies shaped like human bodies. Titus had his weapon. Now he needed a strategy. Going to the police was out. The Solis family had too many officers on their payroll. Going to the prosecutors was equally risky. But there were other ways to use information. Ways that couldn't be bought or silenced. He reached out to Laura Kane, an investigative journalist who'd built her career on exposing corruption. She'd won awards for taking down politicians and corporate executives, and she had a reputation for being absolutely incorruptible. The Solis family had tried to buy her off once, and she'd published the bribe attempt as a sidebar in her next article. They met in a diner outside the city, away from prying eyes. Laura was younger than Titus expected, with sharp eyes and a sharper pen. "This is real?" she asked, scrolling through the files on a secure tablet. Casey Huffman collected it before Cleveland had him killed. These financial records alone would be enough to launch an investigation. But the bodies... She shook her head in disbelief. If those bodies are where the coordinates say they are, this isn't just corruption. This is murder conspiracy. Everyone involved goes down, including Tamika. That's the idea. Laura looked up at him. Why bring this to me? You could have sold this information. Named your price. I don't want money. I want my nephew to be safe. And I want the people who hurt him to pay. Fair enough. She closed the tablet. Give me 2 weeks. I need to verify everything independently, find additional sources, make sure this is bulletproof. Once I publish, there won't be any taking it back. They're already trying to destroy the case against Tamika. The trial is in 3 weeks. Then we work fast. She extended her hand. Welcome to the war, Mr. Bridges. The next 2 weeks were the most intense of Titus's life. During the day, he took care of Owen. He drove him to therapy appointments, cooked him meals, helped him with the schoolwork he was making up from home. The boy was slowly coming back to life. There were moments now when he would smile, even laugh before the shadows crept back into his eyes. Are they going to get in trouble? Owen asked one night, unable to say their names. For what they did? Yes, Titus said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. At night, after Owen was asleep, Titus worked with Laura. She'd assembled a small team, a forensic accountant, a former FBI analyst, 2 other journalists. They tore through Casey's files, verified every detail, built an airtight narrative of the Solis family's crimes spanning 2 decades. But the Solis family wasn't idle either. Titus started noticing cars parked outside his house. Strange clicks on his phone line. A break-in while he was at the grocery store. Nothing taken, but his computer had clearly been searched. Then came the threats. The first was a dead animal left on his doorstep. The second was a photograph of Owen through the window of his therapist's office. The third was a typed note. Drop this or join Casey. Titus didn't drop it. Instead, he installed security cameras, changed his locks, and bought a gun. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Not when he was this close. 1 week before the trial, Laura called with news. The bodies are there. We got a source inside the police crime lab to do unofficial ground-penetrating radar. 3 anomalies, right where Casey said they'd be. When do you publish? Day after tomorrow. I've got meetings with the FBI first thing in the morning. They're taking over jurisdiction. The local cops are too compromised. And if the Solis family tries to stop you, I've got dead man switches at 6 different publications. If anything happens to me, the story runs automatically. Cleveland Solis might be powerful, but he can't kill the truth once it's in motion. Titus exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Thank you, Laura, for everything. Thank me when this is over. And Titus? Watch your back. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. The morning before Lara's story was set to publish, Titus woke to the smell of smoke. He was out of bed in seconds, his hand finding the gun on the nightstand. The smoke was coming from downstairs, thick and acrid, filling the hallway like poison fog. Owen. He kicked open the door to the spare bedroom. The boy was already awake, coughing, his eyes wide with terror. Uncle Titus, what's happening? Fire. We need to go. He grabbed Owen and made for the stairs, but the smoke was worse below. He could see flames licking at the front door, blocking the main exit. Back window. There was a back window in his bedroom that led to a small roof overhang. From there, they could drop to the lawn. He ran back down the hall, Owen clinging to his neck, and threw open the window. The night air was cold and clean after the smoke, and he gulped it gratefully before lowering himself through the opening. I'm going to drop down first, then catch you, he told Owen. Okay. Owen nodded, tears streaming down his face. Titus dropped to the roof, feeling his bad knee protest as he absorbed the impact. Then he held up his arms. Jump, buddy. I've got you. Owen jumped. Titus caught him, and together they scrambled down from the roof and ran across the backyard until they were a safe distance from the burning house. Titus pulled out his phone to call 911, but before he could dial, he saw them, 2 figures emerging from the shadows near his property line. One was a tall man in dark clothes. The other was Cleveland Solis himself. Mr. Bridges. Cleveland's voice was calm, almost pleasant. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Titus pushed Owen behind him, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Stay away from us. I'm afraid that's not possible. Cleveland stepped closer, the firelight from the burning house casting dancing shadows across his face. You've caused me a great deal of trouble. Dug up things that should have stayed buried. My daughter is facing trial because of you. My legacy is threatened. Your legacy is murder and corruption. My legacy is this city. I built it from nothing, and I will not let some blue-collar firefighter tear it down. He gestured to the man beside him. Titus recognized him now as Ernesto Peterson, Cleveland's head of security. Ernesto had his hand inside his jacket, the outline of a weapon visible. The journalist has already talked to the FBI, Titus said. Whatever you do to me, the story comes out tomorrow. Does it? Cleveland smiled. Miss Kane had an unfortunate accident this evening. The home invasion gone wrong. Such a tragedy. Titus felt his blood turn to ice. You're lying. Am I? Cleveland's smile widened. I told you, Mr. Bridges. I don't leave loose ends. Now, you can make this easy. Give me Casey's files, and I'll let the boy live. He's not my blood anyway. Or you can make it difficult. And Ernesto here will demonstrate why I pay him so generously. Titus's mind raced. The gun at his hip held 6 shots. Ernesto was armed and professional. Cleveland was unarmed, but wouldn't hesitate to watch him die. Owen was terrified, clinging to his leg. And Laura, if Cleveland had really killed her. The files aren't here, Titus said slowly. They're backed up in 6 different places. Kill me, and they release automatically. You're bluffing. Try me. Cleveland's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then he gestured sharply. Ernesto. The security man drew his weapon, but Titus was faster. He'd practiced this 100 times in the darkness of his garage, drawing, aiming, firing in a single fluid motion. The shot caught Ernesto in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the grass. Titus turned the gun on Cleveland. "Don't move." Cleveland raised his hands, but his expression was more annoyed than frightened. "You're making a mistake. Kill me, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. My lawyers will. I'm not going to kill you." Titus kept the gun steady. "I'm going to watch you destroy yourself." Red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. Someone had called the fire department, and the police would be right behind them. Cleveland's eyes widened. "You set this up. The fire was your idea. But I knew you'd come." Titus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. "Audio recorder. Everything you just said about Laura, about Casey, about the murders. All of it recorded. That's inadmissible. Illegally obtained. Maybe in court, but not in the news. And this isn't the only recording." Titus smiled grimly. "While your people were breaking into my house last week, I was planting bugs in yours. I've got recordings of you and Tamika discussing Owen. Recordings of you bribing Judge Henderson. Recordings of you ordering the evidence destroyed." Cleveland's face went pale. "You're lying. Check the flower arrangement in your study. The one your wife's assistant brought last week. She doesn't actually work for your wife anymore. She works for me." It had cost Titus almost everything he had, his savings, his second mortgage on his now-burning house. But Marion Atkinson had pointed him to a private investigator named Lynn who specialized in exactly this kind of operation. Together, they'd turned Cleveland's fortress into a glass house. The fire trucks arrived, followed by police cars, an ambulance for Ernesto, and behind them, 2 black SUVs with federal plates. "The FBI was very interested in my recordings," Titus continued, his voice even. "Apparently, they've been building a RICO case against your family for years. They just needed someone on the inside. Or, in this case, someone close enough to get inside." Cleveland lunged at him, all pretense of composure gone. But before he could take 2 steps, federal agents tackled him to the ground. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His screams of protest were drowned out by the roar of water, hoses fighting the flames. Titus sank to his knees, the adrenaline finally draining from his system. Owen was there, wrapping his arms around him, and for a long moment, they just held each other. "Is it over?" Owen whispered. Titus looked at Cleveland being loaded into a federal vehicle, at the flames consuming his house, at the chaos and destruction that had been his life for the past month. "Almost," he said. "Almost." The trial began 6 weeks later, though it was really more of a formality. The evidence against the Solis family was overwhelming. Casey's files, Titus's recordings, the bodies beneath Building 7, exhumed and identified. Laura Kane, who had survived the home invasion thanks to a panic room she'd installed years ago, published her expose, and it spread across the country like wildfire. Cleveland Solis was charged with 4 counts of murder, conspiracy, bribery, and a dozen other offenses. Tamika Solis was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and child abuse. Marlon Bridges pled guilty to accessory charges in exchange for testimony against his wife and father-in-law. Titus sat in the courtroom every day, Owen at his side. The boy was doing better now. He'd started sleeping through the night, had made friends at his new school, and was even laughing again, real laughs that reached his eyes. The jury took 4 hours to deliberate. Cleveland Solis, guilty on all counts. Life without parole. Tamika Solis, guilty on all counts. 45 years. Titus heard the verdicts and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just a vast, empty relief, like the silence after a long storm. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions. He ignored them all and walked to where Detective Atkinson was waiting by her car. "You did it," she said. "Against all odds, you did it. We did it." He shook her hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you and Lynn and Laura. I was just the match that started the fire." Atkinson smiled. "Some match." She handed him an envelope. "This came for you. From Marlon." Titus opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know it will never be enough, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn Owen's forgiveness and yours. I'll testify to everything I know. I'll accept whatever punishment I deserve. And I'll never stop being grateful that you saved my son when I couldn't. Your brother, Marlon. Titus folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He didn't know if he would ever forgive Marlon. Some wounds were too deep, some betrayals too profound. But Owen would meet his father eventually. The real version, not the broken man who'd been controlled by Tamika and her family. Maybe, with time, Marlon could become someone worth knowing again. He walked back to where Owen was waiting, the boy's hand immediately finding his. "Can we go home now?" Owen asked. Titus looked at him. This small, resilient, impossibly brave child who'd survived the unsurvivable. His nephew. His family. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "Let's go home." 6 months later, Titus sat on the porch of his new house, watching Owen play in the backyard. The house was smaller than his old one, nothing fancy, but it was theirs. The insurance money from the fire, combined with the civil suit against the Solis estate, had been enough to start over. Owen had just turned 9. His therapist said he was making remarkable progress, that he was one of the most resilient children she'd ever worked with. Titus suspected that resilience ran in the family. His phone buzzed. A text from Laura. "New story dropping tomorrow. Cleveland's business partners are turning on each other. More arrests coming. You started something big." Titus smiled and set the phone aside. He played his part. Now it was time to focus on what mattered. "Uncle Titus!" Owen ran toward him, clutching something in his hands. "Look what I found. A caterpillar. Can we keep it?" "Sure," Titus said. "We'll make a habitat for it. Watch it turn into a butterfly." Owen grinned, that bright, uncomplicated smile that still felt like a miracle every time Titus saw it. Some things, he'd learned, couldn't be buried forever. Evil had a way of surfacing, and so did truth. The Solis family had tried to bury their crimes, their victims, their own blood. But in the end, it was their secrets that consumed them, dragged into the light by an ordinary man who refused to look away. Titus Bridges wasn't a hero. He was just an uncle who loved his nephew. And sometimes that was enough. Epilogue. The following spring, Cleveland Solis died in prison. Heart attack, the official report said, though rumors swirled about debts owed to dangerous people. Tamika Solis, stripped of her family's protection, became a pariah among the inmates who'd once feared her name. The last Titus heard, she'd been transferred to a maximum security facility after an altercation in the cafeteria. Marlon Bridges served 18 months before being released on good behavior. He moved to another state and started working construction, sending monthly letters to Owen that went mostly unread. But one day, Owen opened one, then another, and slowly, painfully, something like reconciliation began. Detective Marion Atkinson was promoted to lieutenant. Lynn Liu expanded his investigation business. Laura Kane won a Pulitzer and dedicated it to Casey Huffman, whose courage had made justice possible. And Titus Bridges, the man who dug his nephew out of a grave and brought down an empire, lived a quiet life in his small house. He coached Owen's little league team. He taught him to fish. He held him during nightmares and celebrated his victories and loved him with a fierceness that surprised them both. Because that's what family does. They show up. They fight. They save each other one day at a time. Owen was 16 when he finally asked to visit his mother in prison. Titus drove him there and waited in the parking lot, prepared for whatever came next. Owen emerged 2 hours later, his eyes red but his shoulders straight. "I told her I forgive her," he said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Not for her. For me. So I don't have to carry it anymore." Titus looked at this young man. No longer the terrified child he'd pulled from the earth, but someone strong and whole and impossibly brave. "I'm proud of you," he said. Owen smiled, that same smile, somehow both old and new.